Welcome to the Cultural I.O., where we explore the intersection of culture, leadership, and organizational behavior. I'm Dr. Rajanique Modesti, cultural strategist and I.O. psychologist, and this is where we break down workplace dynamics through a lens that actually reflects the world we live in. We're talking about the real patterns, the uncomfortable truths, and the cultural moments that reveal what's really happening in our organizations. On January 1st, I watched the live airing of the Zoran Mamdani inauguration. I listened to speakers talk about building a collectivist society, about creating systems where people's needs matter more than billionaire profits, about shared power and shared prosperity. And after watching that live airing, I left feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that maybe we don't have to accept the way things are. Maybe there's an alternative to workplaces where power is concentrated at the top and everyone else is expendable. So I started researching. I wanted to find proof that this vision already exists in the world, that organizations have figured out how to share power and prosperity, that there's a real model we can point to and say, this works. This is how you build something better. And I found examples like Bob's Red Mill or New Belgium Brewing and Equal Exchange, companies that have tried to do things differently, employee owned companies, worker cooperatives, organizations structured around the very principles I heard in those speeches. But what I discovered was more complicated than I expected, more challenging, and ultimately more honest about just how hard it is to build and sustain alternative models in a capitalistic economy. Today, we're going to examine three organizations that tried to create collectivist workplace cultures. We'll look at what they built, what worked, what failed, and what we can learn from their experiences, because this is more common than people think. And the challenges they faced, those reveal something fundamental about organizational culture, power, and change. Before we dive into specific cases, let's establish what we're talking about. Employee ownership means that workers own a stake in the company they work for, but there are different models and the differences matter. ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, are the most common model in the United States. The company sets up a trust that holds stock for employees. Your ownership stake is typically based on your salary and tenure. When you leave or retire, the company buys back your shares. This is what Bob's Red Mill and New Belgium Brewing used. Worker cooperatives are more radical. Every employee who becomes a member has equal ownership, regardless of their role or tenure. One person, one vote. Profits are shared equally. Democratic governance. This is what Equal Exchange uses. Both models are attempts to create alternatives to traditional corporate structures where shareholders and executives control everything and workers are just labor costs to be minimized. And both models are based on a compelling idea from organizational psychology. When people have ownership, they're more engaged, more committed, and they perform better. There's research backing this up. The National Center for Employee Ownership has studied thousands of employee owned companies. They found that companies with strong ownership cultures see 6 to 11% additional growth per year compared to similar companies without employee ownership. But here's the critical finding: ownership structure alone doesn't create those benefits. What matters is ownership culture, whether employees actually experience the ownership meaningfully, whether they feel like they have a voice, power, and a real stake in the company's success. That distinction between structure and culture is what we're going to explore today. Let's start with Bob's Red Mill, a whole grain foods company based in Oregon. Bob Moore founded the company in 1978. He built it into a nationally recognized brand. And then in 2010, instead of selling it to a corporation and walking away with millions, he did something different. He gave the company to his employees through an ESOP. Bob Moore died in February 2024 at the ripe old age of 94, and because of the ESOP, the transition was smooth. The current CEO, Trey Winthrop, who's been with the company for 17 years, told Business Insider, by becoming 100% employee owned, we knew that when Bob passed that we would control our future. I didn't have to think about external problems. I got to focus internally on all the people here and how we were going to grieve together. Moore had frequently fended off large corporations that wanted to buy Bob's Red Mill. The ESOP protected the company from being acquired after his death. That's remarkable. That's a founder who chose legacy over profit, who prioritized employees over shareholders, who built a structure designed to last. And Winthrop talks about the benefits of employee ownership in glowing terms. We own our jobs. We don't rent them, he says, calling it the company's guiding principle. He describes how being employee owned boosts engagement and retention, creates two-way communication, and gives workers a voice through committees. On paper, this looks like the model working exactly as intended. But then you read what employees actually say. On Indeed, a machine operator titled their review, "Employee Owned Means Nothing." They described 12-hour shifts as inhumane. No support from HR when needed. Employees didn't feel empowered to ask for basics like chairs or access to water in production areas, despite being told they were employee owners. Virtually no formalized training, supervisors pressuring workers to falsify quality logs when protocol wasn't followed. Another employee wrote, "Leadership makes or breaks this place. The employee ownership aspect of the company is great and has lots of benefits. Unfortunately, there are a lot of petty people in management positions that make a lot of departments fall short." One review praised the people they work with, but said upper management is just a bunch of power hungry human beings that do not care for your personal safety or health. Multiple employees noted that benefits and conditions had been steadily declining over the past several years. Now, these are individual reviews. Not every employee shares these experiences. Some reviews are very positive about the culture and benefits, but the pattern is striking. Even in an employee-owned company with a structure designed to share power, employees are describing classic toxic workplace dynamics: disempowerment, management that doesn't listen, declining conditions, the gap between what ownership is supposed to mean and what it actually feels like. From an IO psychology perspective, what's happening here? The National Center for Employee Ownership Research I mentioned earlier identifies 6 elements that create effective ownership cultures: sharing information, training and cross-training, meetings and decision-making forums, performance measurement systems, individual and team incentives, and open book management. When you look at Bob's Red Mill employee reviews through that lens, you can see the gaps. Virtually no formalized training, employees don't feel empowered, do not care for your personal safety or health. These aren't descriptions of a high involvement, idea generating culture. These are descriptions of a command and control culture that happens to have an ESOP attached to it. And this is where middle management becomes critical. Bob Moore created the structure. Trey Winthrop, as CEO, believes in the model. But if middle managers are power hungry and petty, if they're pressuring workers to falsify logs and denying basic needs, then the ownership culture never reaches the shop floor where most employees actually work. This is the same dynamic we saw at Boeing. The structure at the top can be sound. Leadership can have good intentions, but culture is carried by middle managers. They're the ones making day-to-day decisions about whether employees get training, whether concerns are heard, whether ownership means anything beyond a retirement account. Bob's Red Mill demonstrates that employee ownership can survive founder transition. The structure is durable, but structure alone doesn't guarantee that employees experience the empowerment, voice, and shared power that ownership is supposed to provide. New Belgium Brewing tells a different story about the fragility of employee ownership. The company started in a basement in Fort Collins, Colorado in the early 1990s. They made Fat Tire, a beer that became so iconic that locals would tell people, I'm from Fort Collins. Oh, I love Fat Tire. As one longtime resident put it, New Belgium really put us on the map. New Belgium became 100% employee owned. They were held up as a success story in the craft beer industry. Employee ownership plus quality beer, environmental responsibility. They represented an alternative model that seemed to be working. And then in 2019, they sold to Lion Little World Beverages, a subsidiary of Kirin Holdings, a Japanese conglomerate. The ESOP ended, employee ownership disappeared. The sale was controversial. Kirin's business dealings in Myanmar had come under fire by Amnesty International and other human rights groups. Allegations that the company's operations there financially benefited a military accused of serious human rights abuses. Protesters showed up. New Belgium, shame on you. But New Belgium stood by the decision. A company spokesperson said Kirin had a commitment to culture and the well-being of our coworkers. The business justification was straightforward. Peter Burkhardt, who spent more than 2 decades as New Belgium's brewmaster, put it simply: the craft beer market is more competitive than ever, and makers need a lot of capital if they want to keep growing. And here's the thing: the sale provided significant financial benefits to employees. Over 300 individuals reportedly earned more than $100,000 each from ESOP payout. For many long-term employees, that's life-changing money: retirement security, mortgages paid off, college funds for kids. So employees got what employee ownership is supposed to provide: a meaningful share in the financial success of the company they've helped build. But what was lost? That same Fort Collins resident who talked about New Belgium putting the city on the map, she said after the sale, "It's going to be really sad for me. It won't be as much of a point of pride." The alternative model disappeared. New Belgium is no longer employee owned. It's owned by a multinational corporation. The next generation of New Belgium workers won't own anything. They won't have a voice in how the company runs. They're just employees. From an IO psychology perspective, this raises fundamental questions about the durability of employee ownership as an alternative to traditional capitalism. The academic research on employee stock options by Capelli, Kanyan, and Almeida, published in the ILR Review, found something important. They compared two mechanisms by which stock options affect performance: incentive effects and social exchange effects. The incentive argument is straightforward. If you own stock, you'll work harder to make the company more valuable because it benefits you financially. But they found that social exchange effects were actually 5 times more powerful than incentive effects. Social exchange means that when the company shares ownership with you, when you perceive that as a gift, you reciprocate with better performance out of a sense of obligation and gratitude. The key word there is perceive. Social exchange only works when employees actually experience what they receive as valuable and meaningful. At New Belgium, employees did receive real value. That $100,000 payout was tangible. But once they sold, the social exchange relationship ended. There's no reciprocal obligation to Karen. The gift came from New Belgium's employee ownership model, and that model is gone. And here's the deeper problem. If employee ownership can be sold away whenever market pressures make it more profitable to sell than to sustain, then is it really an alternative model? Or is it just a staging ground for eventual acquisition? New Belgium lasted about 25 years as employee owned. That's not nothing. But it's also not a permanent transformation of how business is done. It's one generation of workers who benefited, and then the structure reverted to traditional corporate ownership. The question becomes, what would it take to make employee ownership durable enough to resist these market pressures? And that's where our third case study becomes really interesting. Equal Exchange is a worker-owned cooperative that imports and sells fair trade coffee, tea, chocolate, and other products. And structurally, they're the most radical of our three cases. The company was founded in 1986 by three people who had worked together at a New England food co-op: Jonathan Rosenthal, Michael Rosine, and Rick Dickinson. They spent 3 years meeting weekly to plan how to transform their relationship between consumers and farmers around the world. They wanted to build an organization that would help farmers gain economic control, educate consumers about trade issues, provide high quality food, and be controlled by the people who did the actual work. In 1990, they formalized Equal Exchange as a worker owned cooperative. Every employee who becomes a worker owner has exactly one vote, not one vote per share, one vote per person. Regardless of whether you're the CEO or an entry-level employee, your vote counts the same. To become a worker owner, you have to work there for at least a year and be approved by 80% of current owners. Then you purchase a share of Class A stock, currently priced around $3,870, often financed through interest-free payroll deductions. The company maintains a 5-to-1 pay ratio cap. The highest paid employee earns no more than 5 times what the lowest paid employee earns. Profits are distributed equally among all worker owners at the end of each year, not based on individual performance or seniority. And here's the really interesting structural protection. They have what they call a never sell out clause. If the company is ever sold, all net proceeds must be donated to another alternative trading organization. This removes any financial incentive for worker owners to sell the company to a larger corporation. They've also found creative ways to raise capital without compromising worker control. They offer Class B preferred shares to outside mission aligned investors. These shares pay a target dividend but carry no voting rights. Investors can't sell them on a secondary market. They can only sell them back to the company after holding them for at least 5 years. This addresses the exact problem that led New Belgium to sell: the need for growth capital. Equal Exchange found a way to get that capital without giving up democratic control. And it's worked. Equal Exchange has been operating successfully for 38 years. They now have over 100 worker owners. They're one of the largest worker cooperatives in the country. They've grown from $100,000 startup in 1986 to over 50 million in annual sales. They've been profitable enough to invest in and rescue other alternative trade organizations. In 2008, they invested in OK USA, a fair trade produce company that was effectively in bankruptcy. They invested in their sister organization, Equal Exchange UK, twice, in 2013 and 2017, to keep it operating. In 2014, they invested in La Siembra, a Canadian worker cooperative, to prevent it from being demutualized and taken over by venture capitalists. Today, Equal Exchange US, Equal Exchange UK, La Siembra, and OK are all in business, profitable, and together they sell over 80 million annually. Equal Exchange has built an ecosystem of worker-owned alternative trade organizations. By every structural measure, Equal Exchange should be the model that works. They're more democratic than an ESOP. They built protections against selling out. They found ways to raise capital. They've sustained the model for nearly 4 decades. They've proven that worker cooperatives can be profitable and can grow. On their website, they say, at Equal Exchange, we all walk around like we own the place. That's because we all do. They explicitly list the democratic principles: the right to vote, one vote per employee, not per share; the right to serve as a board director; the right to information through open book management; the right to speak your mind. But then you read employee reviews on Glassdoor and you hear something different. One former director who worked there for more than 10 years wrote, "The company does fantastic work on behalf of small farmers around the world. Coffee, tea, chocolate are top notch. great health and vacation benefits. But then, founder CEO has been there since 1986. Although nominally a worker cooperative business, the founder keeps tight control on what is up for debate by workers and what is his alone to decide. Does not take kindly to those challenging his views. It is rare for people to be able to move through the ranks of management. Another employee wrote, people feel empowered by the co-op element, but at the end of the day, don't really have a say in the real direction of the company. A group of long timers really decides everything. Low pay for region, not a lot of room to move up. A third review noted, fun work environment, good perks, room to run with ideas and projects, ownership and the cooperative process, but also low pay. Group of long timers really decides everything. Now, let's be clear about what we're seeing here. Rick Dinkinson, one of the three co-founders, became co-executive director in 1999. As of 2019, when the board approved a new 10-year vision for the company, he was still in leadership. That's 33 years after founding the organization. There's nothing inherently wrong with the long tenure. Institutional knowledge matters. Continuity can be valuable. But when employees say the founder keeps tight control and does not take kindly to those challenging his views, it raises questions. Equal exchange has one person, one vote democracy. Every worker owner has equal voting power. So how does a founder maintain control for 33 plus years in a democratic organization? This is where we get to the subtle reality of power that formal structures can't always address. Informal networks, institutional knowledge built over decades, relationships with every major stakeholder, the social capital that comes from being the founder, the person who built this from nothing, who fought the Reagan administration to import Nicaraguan coffee, who has been the face of the organization for nearly 4 decades. In IO psychology, we talk about French and Raven's basis of powers. Legitimate power comes from your formal position, but there's also referent power, which comes from people wanting to be associated with you, respecting you, trusting your judgment. There's expert power, which comes from knowledge and experience, and there's connection power, which comes from your network and relationships. A founder who's been leading an organization for 33 years has accumulated all of these forms of power. And even in a democratic structure where everyone's vote counts equally, that informal power shapes what gets voted on, how decisions are framed, whose ideas get taken seriously, and who feels comfortable challenging the status quo. The research on founder syndrome and nonprofits and mission-driven organizations shows this pattern repeatedly. Founders who build organizations around their vision often struggle to let go of control, even when they genuinely believe in democratic governance. They're not necessarily being hypocritical. They often can't see how informal power is shaping outcomes because, from their perspective, they're just participating like everyone else. But from the perspective of other worker owners, especially newer ones, it can feel like the democratic structure is window dressing, like decisions are predetermined, like there's an in-group of long timers who really run things and everyone else just has an illusion of voice. This doesn't mean equal exchange has failed. They've accomplished remarkable things. They've sustained a worker cooperative for 38 years. They've stayed profitable. They've resisted selling out. They've invested in keeping other alternative organizations alive. They've proven that the model can work. But what they haven't fully solved is how to distribute power in a way that matches their democratic structure. How to ensure that one person, one vote actually feels like shared governance and not just formal equality masking informal hierarchy. And if equal exchange with arguably the most radical democratic structure in American business, with explicit bylaws preventing financial incentives to sell, with a 38-year track record of success, still struggles with this, what does that tell us about how hard it actually is to build genuinely collectivist workplace cultures? So we have 3 cases. Bob's Red Mill has a structure, but employees report feeling disempowered. New Belgium delivered financial value, but the structure disappeared when selling became more profitable. Equal Exchange has the most protective structure and still struggles with founder control and insider dynamics. What's going on here? And what does research tell us about what actually makes employee ownership work? The National Center for Employee Ownership has been studying this for decades. Their research is clear. Ownership structure alone doesn't create performance benefits. What matters is ownership culture. They've identified 6 elements that high-performing employee-owned companies have in common. First, sharing information, not just financial results, but real transparency about challenges, opportunities, strategic decisions. Employees can't think and act like owners if they don't have access to the information owners need. Second, training and cross-training, building skills, creating opportunities for growth, helping people understand different parts of the business. This builds capacity and creates pathways for people to contribute more meaningfully. Third, meetings and decision-making forums, real spaces where employees have voice and influence, not just symbolic participation, where their input actually shapes outcomes. Fourth, performance measurement systems, clear, transparent metrics that everyone understands and that connect individual and team contributions to organizational success. Fifth, individual and team incentives, rewards that align with ownership, not just base compensation, ways for people to benefit from the success they help create. Sixth, open book management, full financial transparency, teaching employees to read financial statements, understand profit and loss, see how their decisions affect the bottom line. Companies that implement all 6 elements see measurable results. The NCEO research found that high involvement, idea generating cultures generate an incremental 6 to 11% additional growth per year over what their prior performance would have predicted. But here's what the research also shows. Creating these cultures is hard work. It requires sustained commitment from leadership. It requires training managers to actually involve employees rather than just tell them what to do. It requires building systems and changing habits and constantly reinforcing the ownership culture. And most organizations don't do all 6 consistently. They do some, they do them partially, they implement them at the top, but not on the shop floor, or they do them well initially, but let them erode over time. When I look at Bob's Red Mill through this lens, I see the gaps. Virtually no formalized training. That's element 2 missing. Employees don't feel empowered to ask for basics. That suggests weak decision-making forums and information sharing. Benefits have been declining. That indicates that commitment to equitable distribution of resources is weakening. The structure exists. The ESOP is real, but the culture that would make the structure meaningful isn't fully there, at least not for all employees. At Equal Exchange, they likely do many of these elements well. Open book management is part of their stated principles. They have democratic governance structures, but if a group of long-timers really decides everything, then the decision-making forums aren't as open as they appear. If people feel they can't challenge the founder's views, then there's not real psychological safety for voice. The academic research I mentioned earlier on employee stock options found that social exchange matters more than incentive effects. But social exchange only happens when employees perceive what they received as a genuine gift, when they feel the company has shared something valuable with them. If the ownership structure exists, but the day-to-day experience is still top-down management, still lack a voice, still feeling like you're just labor rather than the owner, then the social exchange never forms. The structure doesn't translate into reciprocal relationship that drives engagement and performance. This maps into broader IO psychology research on psychological ownership. You can have legal ownership without psychological ownership. Psychological ownership is the feeling that something is mine, that I have a stake in it, that I can influence it, that its success or failure matters to me personally. Legal ownership through an ESOP or worker cooperative can help create psychological ownership, but it doesn't automatically do so. What creates psychological ownership is control, intimate knowledge, and investment of the self. Control means I have real influence over decisions. Intimate knowledge means I understand how things work and how my contributions matter. Investment of the self means I put time, energy, ideas into this organization and I see my mark on it. If employee ownership structures don't create those experiences, then they don't create psychological ownership. And without psychological ownership, the structure is just paperwork. There's another dimension to this that we need to address. Can these alternative models last? Bob's Red Mill has shown that ESOPs can survive founder transition. That's significant. Bob Moore died in 2024, and the company continues as employee-owned under CEO Trey Winthrop. The structure has proven durable through succession. Equal Exchange has demonstrated even longer durability, 38 years and counting. Multiple leadership transitions through the founders remain involved. They weathered economic downturns, including coffee prices hitting a 100-year low in 2001. They've adapted their business model, added new products, opened new markets. The cooperative structure has sustained. But New Belgium shows us the fragility. 25 years as employee owned and then gone when the market made selling more profitable than sustaining. The business justification was real. The craft beer market is intensely competitive. Growth requires capital, advertising, distribution, new equipment, geographic expansion. These things cost money. And while Equal Exchange found ways to raise capital through non-voting preferred shares, that's not always enough or fast enough for industries with rapid change and intense competition. So companies face a choice: grow more slowly with the constraints of employee ownership, or sell to a larger company with deeper pockets and join the traditional capitalist structure. New Belgium chose to sell, and employees benefited financially. Over 300 people got life-changing payouts. That's not nothing. That's real wealth creation for working people. But the model disappeared, and that raises the question: is employee ownership just a staging ground for eventual acquisition? Do these companies exist as employee-owned only until they're valuable enough for someone else to buy? There's research on organizational life cycles by Larry Greiner and others that's relevant here. Organizations go through predictable stages of growth, and each stage creates different challenges. Early stages are about creativity and leadership. Middle stages are about delegation and coordination. Later stages are about collaboration and renewal. Employee-owned companies face all these normal challenges plus an additional one. How do you raise capital for growth without giving up the ownership structure that defines you? Traditional companies can issue stock, take on investors, or go public. Employee-owned companies have more limited options, retain earnings, or grow slowly. They can borrow, but that increases risk. They can create non-voting share classes like Equal Exchange did, but that only works if you find mission-aligned investors willing to accept limited returns. Or they can sell. And if the price is right, if employees get significant payouts, why wouldn't they vote to sell? This is where Equal Exchange's never sell out clause is so interesting. By requiring that proceeds go to another alternative organization rather than to worker owners, they remove the financial incentive to sell. Worker owners can't get rich by selling the company. They only benefit if they stay and the company remains successful. That's a structural protection against the New Belgium outcome. But it also means asking worker owners to value the model itself over their own potential financial gain, to prioritize mission over money. That's a big ask, especially for employees who aren't highly paid to begin with. From an IO psychology perspective, this connects the research on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is doing something because it's meaningful, because you believe in it. Extrinsic motivation is doing it for the external rewards like money. Employee ownership models that work long term probably need both. The intrinsic motivation of being part of something different, of having voice and ownership, of building an alternative to traditional capitalism, and the extrinsic motivation of financial security, good pay, and the potential for wealth building. If the model provides mission but not money, people leave or they eventually vote to sell. If it provides money but not mission, it's just capitalism with a different legal structure. You need both. And that's really hard to sustain, especially in competitive industries with high capital requirements. So, what does all of this mean for organizations that aren't employee owned? Because most of us don't work in worker cooperatives or ESOPs. We work in traditional companies. What can we learn from these cases? First, structure matters, but culture matters more. You can have all the right policies, all the right org charts, all the right procedures, but if the day-to-day experience doesn't match what those structures promise, the structure is meaningless. This applies to everything from diversity and inclusion initiatives to performance management systems to leadership development programs. If your company says it values innovation but punishes failure, people won't innovate. If you say you want employee voice but retaliate when people speak up, you'll get silence. What you do matters more than what you say. Second, middle management is where culture lives or dies. Senior leadership can set strategy and espouse values, but middle managers are the ones making thousands of daily decisions that either reinforce or undermine that culture. If your middle managers don't embody the culture you're trying to build, it won't happen. This is what we saw at Boeing, and it's what we're seeing at Bob's Red Mill. The CEO talks about ownership culture, but if managers on the floor are power hungry and don't care about worker safety, the ownership means nothing to those workers. Third, power doesn't disappear just because you change structures. Formal equality doesn't automatically create actual equality. People bring different amounts of social capital, network connections, institutional knowledge, and informal influence to supposedly democratic processes. If you want genuinely distributed power, you have to actively work to redistribute those informal sources of power. That means developing people's skills, rotating leadership, creating space for newer and quieter voices, calling out when informal hierarchies are shaping outcomes. It's ongoing work, not a structural fix. Fourth, what you incentivize is what you get. New Belgium faced pressure to grow or be left behind. That pressure made selling rational. If you want organization to prioritize things other than short-term financial gain, you have to change the incentive structures that make short-term financial gain the only rational choice. This applies internally too. If you say you want collaboration but only reward individual performance, you'll get competition. If you say you want long-term thinking but only measure quarterly results, you'll get short-termism. Fifth, sustainability requires dealing with market realities. You can build alternative models, but they exist within capitalism. They face competitive pressures. They need capital to grow. They have to pay wages that compete with other employees. You can't ignore those realities and expect your alternative models to survive. Equal exchange has lasted 38 years, partly because they found creative ways to raise capital while protecting worker control. Bob's Red Mill has survived partly because they're in a stable industry without the intense competition that craft beer faces. New Belgium sold partly because craft beer markets are brutal and growth requires resources they couldn't generate internally. Understanding your industry context and building your model accordingly matters. Sixth, founders need succession plans that actually distribute power. Rink Dickinson has been at Equal Exchange for 38 years, in leadership for 25. That institutional knowledge is valuable, but it also concentrates power in ways that democratic structures can't fully address. Organizations need to be intentional about developing next generation leaders, rotating people through influential roles and creating pathways for power to actually transfer rather than just accumulate with whoever's been there longest. And finally, psychological safety is everything. If people don't feel safe speaking up, challenging ideas, raising concerns, admitting mistakes, then none of the structural elements of ownership culture can function. You'll have all the forms of democracy with none of the substance. This connects to research by Amy Edmondson at Harvard. Psychological safety, the belief that you won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up, is one of the most important predictors of team performance, innovation, and ethical behavior. Employee-owned companies should theoretically have high psychological safety because everyone's an owner. But if the founder does not take kindly to those challenging his views, or if managers are power hungry, then the ownership structure doesn't create the psychological safety it should. So we come back to the question I started with. Can we build genuinely collectivist workplace cultures? Can employee ownership deliver on its promise? The answer I've arrived at is yes, but it's much harder than just changing the ownership structure. Bob's Red Mill, New Belgium, and Equal Exchange all prove that employee ownership can work. They've created value for employees. They've sustained alternative models for years or decades. They've shown that you don't have to structure organization the way we've always structured them. But they also show the limits, the gap between structure and culture at Bob's Red Mill, the fragility when market pressures hit at New Belgium, the persistence of founder control, even the most democratic structure at Equal Exchange. These aren't failures, they're lessons about what it actually takes to build and sustain alternatives. Based on the research and these cases, here's what I think it requires. You need the structure, the formal mechanisms for ownership, governance, information sharing, and decision making. Equal Exchange has this right. One person, one vote, open books, democratic processes, protection against selling out. But structure alone isn't enough. You need the culture. The NCE 6 elements, real information sharing, meaningful training, genuine decision-making forums where employees have a voice, transparent performance measurement, incentives aligned with ownership, open book management that builds financial literacy. And you need leadership that's committed to distributing power, not just talking about it. Leaders who actively develop others, who rotate influential roles, who create safe spaces for dissenting voices, who check their own informal power and work to equalize it. You need psychological safety. People have to feel they can speak up, challenge ideas, admit mistakes, raise concerns without being punished or marginalized. This requires active work by leaders to model vulnerability, to respond well to challenge, to separate disagreement from disrespect. You need economic sustainability within market realities, creative capital strategies like equal exchanges, non-voting shares, realistic assessment of competitive dynamics, willingness to grow more slowly if that's what preserving the model requires, or clarity that the model is time limited and valuable even if not permanent. And you need to confront the hard truth that building genuinely democratic workplaces means giving up power if you have it. For founders like Rink Dickinson, it means actively stepping back even when you believe your judgment is best. For managers at Bob's Red Mill, it means actually involving workers in decisions rather than just telling them they're owners. For all of us, it means recognizing that shared power feels threatening when we're used to hierarchy. This connects to frame shift, the methodology I've developed, building the muscle to navigate complexity, conflict, and change, because transitioning from hierarchical to democratic structures is all three. It's complex because power operates through formal and informal channels. It's conflictual because people disagree about decisions and directions, and it's change that threatens existing ways of operating. Employee ownership doesn't solve those challenges. It creates new versions of them. And sustaining these models requires building collective capacity to navigate them, not just putting new structures in place and hoping that's enough. So here's where I've landed after researching this episode. I went into this inspired by the vision of collectivist workplaces, of shared power and shared prosperity, and I found companies that are genuinely trying to build that. Bob's Red Mill gave the company to employees and structured it to survive founder transition. New Belgium created real wealth for workers with over 300 people getting 100,000 plus payouts. Equal Exchange has sustained a worker cooperative for 38 years with explicit democratic governance and protections against selling out. Those aren't theoretical models. Those are real organizations that have provided real benefits to real workers. But I also found that the gap between structure and culture is persistent, that market pressures make alternative models fragile, that informal power concentrates even formally democratic organizations, that building genuinely collectivist workplaces is harder than any ownership structure can solve on its own. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The vision from that inauguration speech, the idea of workplaces where people share power and prosperity, that's still worth working toward. But it means being honest about how hard it is, about the ongoing work required, about the ways power reasserts itself even when we build structures to distribute it, about the market realities that make sustaining alternatives difficult. And it means recognizing that structure is necessary but not sufficient, that we need ownership culture, not just ownership structure, that we need to build collective capacity to navigate the complexity that comes with actually sharing power, not just the forms of democracy. The companies I researched for this episode aren't perfect, but they're trying something that matters. And their struggles teach us more than their successes because those struggles reveal what we're actually up against when we try to build organizations differently. That's the work, not just designing new structures, but doing the hard, ongoing cultural work that makes those structures meaningful.
Thank you for listening to The Cultural I.O. I'm Dr. Rajanique Modesti, and I'll see you next time.